Design.
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 Design means to plan.
Human.
Substance.
Technology.
Designing for a better future.
What is design really?
Let's talk about design.
Making an impact in the world.
The power of design to improve life.
Design to survive.
Every day, most of us log onto our devices for hours on end. We write emails, take Zoom calls,
Hey Lesley, how's it going?
binge on Netflix, and scroll social media. And each time we're online, we generate masses of data. It's something we rarely think about until we get that irritating notification, your storage limit is up. Over the past 30 years, we've gone from a time of floppy disks and cassette tapes to cloud storage and backup servers.
You're really into computers, huh?
Yeah.
Today, we collectively generate about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day. To give you an idea of how much that is, if you laid out 2.5 quintillion pennies, they'd cover the Earth's surface 5 times over. And from the Apples to Amazons, almost every major company has dozens of energy-sapping data centers just to store these constant streams of information. These digital footprints, whether important or trivial, are a looming disaster for our planet. And by 2025, it's projected the world will generate 160 zettabytes of data. That's more bytes than there are stars in the observable universe. Conventional storage methods today don't have the capacity or longevity to meet this rapidly growing demand. So, where will all of this data go? Like many design problems we've faced before, nature might hold the answer. DNA is a storage medium perfected by the natural world over 3 billion years of evolution. It can store millions of times more information in the same volume as conventional solutions and can last for thousands of years. If we could replicate or harness this natural phenomenon, could we avoid a data doomsday that's potentially just around the corner? Welcome to Can Design Save Us, a series exploring design as a pioneering force for good. We dive into the most pressing problems of our time and meet people using design to solve them. We explore the good, bad, complex, and controversial. My name is Lesley Price, host from the Index Project, and my guest today is Sean Mihm, Senior Mechanical Engineer at Catalog. Catalog is building the world's first DNA-based platform for massive digital data storage and computation. Named as one of Time's best inventions, Catalog's replicating tech is able to print data on blank, synthetic strands of DNA, meaning a football field worth of storage capacity could fit into a DNA-based container the size of a sugar cube. But thank you so much for joining us, Sean, and it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Lesley.
I would love to hear a bit about your background and how you originally became acquainted with Catalog DNA. From what I read, you initially founded a company that helped to assess someone's risk of heart attack.
So prior to Catalog, I helped co-found a startup called Thrombus Check. And what we were doing is we created a digital microfluidic device that assesses someone's risk for heart attack or stroke. And so what it did is it took a small amount of a patient's blood. It assessed that blood for your risk factors. So we tried to recreate a heart attack essentially on a microfluidic chip to assess someone's risk profile. Mm-hmm. So we did that for a couple years. We raised kind of some different types of funding. Ultimately, though, it ran its course after a couple years. We ran into issues when we were going into patients and kind of testing the variability between patients, and had kind of too high of variability for kind of a commercial application. Mm-hmm. So it got rolled back into a PhD project. So it's still going. Hopefully it's a nice technology that hopefully can one day become commercialized. But ultimately it hit that kind of inflection point a lot of startups hit, right, where that variability point, it wasn't worth kind of continuing forward with the results we were getting. Mm-hmm. So my background though in that was a lot of microfluidics. So my education comes in chemical and biomolecular engineering. And that startup kind of was a combination of biologics with coatings and proteins combined with amount of mechanical engineering with design of microfluidic chips and device automation. So it's kind of a small benchtop device. And so after that startup, I knew I wanted to kind of stay in that biotech space. You kind of get a bug for it. Once you start going into biotech, you start kind of getting into the community.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Really kind of learning about what biotech can do and all the amazing things it's really doing in the industry. And so I was looking really to kind of actually move up to Boston. Boston's a great place for biotech. It's kind of a big biotech hub. And I thought for sure I was just going to go into like a therapeutics role, pharma role, kind of keeping that microfluidics, a lot of kind of cool inventions still coming out of that space.
When we talk about the microfluidic, if I can pronounce that correctly, the
Absolutely.
chips, are we talking about a chip that you essentially put a piece of like a drop of fluid on there and then you can sort of extract a lot of information? Is that what we mean?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so we did it a little bit differently where instead of just a single drop, we actually flowed a small amount of liquid. So we had a small inlet, we flowed it, and because what we were doing is recreating essentially a heart attack. So our flow, we had to create that flow. But yeah, we're taking a really small amount of liquid and trying to get as much information from it as possible.
Yeah, makes sense. As we mentioned, we'll mention earlier in the intro that DNA, of course, is one of our most ancient means of storage. And you guys at Catalog are basically able to, I'm not sure if you'd say manipulate or use or recreate it in a way that we can use DNA to store many other things. It kind of sounds pretty far-fetched, but if you can try to explain it to our listeners in layman terms, if that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it definitely sounds like science fiction, right? The first time you hear DNA data storage or information storing in DNA, you just think that you read a sci-fi book or heard some excerpt from something. And it's weird to think that it's an actual application that is being done right now, right today. So I think it's important to start, though, that the idea of storing information in DNA has been around for several decades. So we're not kind of the first people to say, okay, how do you put information in DNA? And a lot of it comes from people who've looked at nature for a long time for different designs and different aspects. But nature's done a really good job of creating DNA as a storage medium. And for a while now, people have been looking at proteins and mapping proteins to their linear sequence of bases in a DNA molecule. And so in a very similar approach, people can encode information into DNA by taking binary. So binary is just a series of ones and zeros, and then mapping that onto a linear sequence of DNA. So very similar to what kind of the science aspect has been doing with mapping DNA onto a protein, we can then map binary onto a DNA molecule instead. So a very standard approach to this is you take a string of binary, a string of those ones and zeros, and you want to map those to the bases of DNA. So DNA has 4 bases, A, T, G, and C.
This is the technical stuff, guys. Yeah.
I'm trying to keep it high level.
No. It's not. Yeah, we've got the whole interview to sort of wrap our heads around it. So carry on.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have those 4 bases, and what you can do is you can break down a string of binary into sets so that they get encoded by one of those bases. So for instance, A might represent the bits 1, 1. T might represent the bits 0, 0. G, 0, 1. And C, 1, 0. So with that, you can take a binary string. So if it's 0, 1, 0, 1, you can then build a DNA sequence with 2 Gs in a row. And now you've encoded those 4 bits into DNA. And so on the back end, what you would do is you'd be creating that DNA string. So you'd be putting those Gs, you put another G, and you start building this DNA strand. And that's kind of a very standard approach to this space right now. And the issue with it, though, is it's pretty slow and it's pretty cost intensive, right? Because
Yeah,
you can
I
think
can
about
imagine.
it, you're doing it one base at a time. And you can potentially parallelize it or other things, but it really kind of takes that time. What we did is we kind of saw that problem and we kind of tried to turn it on its head a little bit. And instead of going base by base, what we do is we take that binary string and convert it into, say, blocks of binary. So groups or sets of binary, more than just 2 bits of binary. It's now quite a few bits of binary. And what we do is we map those to a prefabricated DNA sequence. So we take a DNA sequence now, and it represents now quite a few bits of binary. And when we have a full string of binary, all we're doing is selecting each of those DNA molecules that we've fabricated previously and just assembling them in the right order so that they now represent that binary string. So at a very high level, you have your data file. So let's say it's an image, you have like a JPEG file.
Yep, perfect, yeah.
A JPEG file you can convert into binary. And so that's, again, just a series of ones and zeros. We then take those series of ones and zeros and break it into blocks of binary. So just subsets of that binary string. We then map those binary blocks to our DNA molecules we've already built. And based on what those blocks are, we just select which DNA molecules we want. And by selecting them in the right order and kind of assembling them just together, so end on end, we're able to then ultimately create that binary and encode it now into DNA.
So if we're talking about, so if you're compressing images or text files or films or videos or archival data, that you guys can essentially compress, let's say, a whole data center into what would you compare it to? I know you've used the phrase like a sugar cube, for example. I mean, is that what we're talking here? Yeah,
absolutely. So a data center, I think a very standard kind of data center is going to store about an exabyte of information, and that takes up about a football field of size.
Okay.
So they're pretty large. And yeah, that's our example we like to use is you can take that exabyte that is a data center. If you put it all into DNA, it could be the size of a sugar cube. Okay. So just a little bit of a gram sugar cube, and that's an exabyte of data. So exabyte is more than most people ever see in their life. So that's 1 billion gigabytes is what it is.
Yeah, we've just been dealing with quintillions and zettabytes in the intro and everything. So yeah, that's really crazy. But why is this something we need? I think most of us understand that in our personal and professional lives, we do generate a lot of data. But why is it important at a global scale from your perspective?
So obviously, as an individual, you create a lot of data. And then if you think about a company is just creating multitudes more data than even an individual. And in today's age, data is really kind of core technology or core product for these people and for these companies. And it's something that they don't want to lose and hold on to. So everyone stores almost all of their data right now. And they store the data in the cloud. And if you think about what is the cloud is really you're putting your data somewhere and it's just living in one of these large data centers. And these large data centers, they take up a lot of space. They take up a lot of electricity as well. So they take up cities worth of electricity. And that because of that, they're also putting off a lot of emissions. And so they put off more emissions, data centers do, than the entire airline industry. So it makes a pretty big impact, right? And if you think about like another example we like to use or analogy we like to use is the data center itself takes in more electricity, or all of the data centers in the world take in more electricity than the entire country of Austria. And it's amazing to think that data centers, this kind of technology and this just ability to store our data takes up more energy than an entire country. And it's not slowing down, right?
Yeah.
So that's today. And if you think about our amount of data we're storing, amount of data we're collecting, it's exponential. So it's just going to become more and more electricity, more and more emissions, and just a bigger and bigger problem to solve.
Yeah, of course, and it's something that none of us, well, most of us generally just don't think about whatsoever. But yeah, as you mentioned before, that what you guys do at Catalog, it is very much like science fiction. I mean, with your background, was it relatively easy for you to grasp the tech? Or did it take a while for you to fully comprehend basically what you guys are doing?
It's a good question. My background, at least, coming from kind of biomolecular engineering, I did have kind of the biochemistry education. So I think that helps, is I'm not trying to just fully learn a lot about biochemistry as well. But I think it doesn't dawn on you for a little bit of how complex and how all of the mechanisms of this technology really entails for a little bit of time, for sure. So day one, you go in and it definitely seems like this foreign idea and you think you have like a high level grasp of it, but it really does take months. It takes kind of working with the team, really seeing that process go all the way through to really kind of start to be like, oh, okay, here's all the intricacies of it. Because at a high level, it does make sense, right? What you're doing, you're just mapping binary to the DNA. And then the complexities come of how do you do all of those tiny little steps in between reliably, consistently, so that you really get what you need as a product. And so I think it took kind of a couple months because it's watching that process happen. And I think the first time you really see it end to end is when it finally kind of clicks.
I can imagine it's pretty mind-blowing, right?
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
So you see those, like what's going on, all the idea of this data, you see a file go in, and then you see the tiny little droplet come out, and you go, wow, that's what all of the data is stored in. And until you see it kind of in person that first time, it's an abstract idea, right?
Yeah,
but
definitely.
then you kind of see it really happen, and it's very, very interesting. But watching that process occur, I think, is when it finally fully clicks for you.
Mm-hmm. So you've been with Catalog for about 2 years now. What's your typical day-to-day look like? Or what are you sort of running during the day?
Yeah, I've been at Catalog a little over 2 years now, and it's been quite a journey over these 2 years. So when I first joined, we were finishing up our custom instrument that's able to write data into DNA, and we've kind of finished that production. And so now my day-to-day is a lot of working on that instrument, continuing to develop it. So this instrument is our DNA writer. It's named Shannon. And Shannon
Love the name.
Is able to write at kind of that megabit per second rate. So it's kind of like a slow internet connection, but it's incredible to think that we're storing data into something biologic at those kind of rates. And so my day-to-day is a lot of working with that instrument. So we have kind of a couple core things we're really pushing for. It kind of focuses around reliability and consistency. So for us to really break into that storage market, it's a market that has a lot of error correction and redundancy built into it because you want your data to be safe. And so for us to break into the storage market, we have to make sure that we meet those same standards. So making sure that every time we encode that information and put that information into DNA, how do we design for that consistency and reliability?
I can imagine it's a bit of a hard sell to potential new clients. Don't worry, it's completely safe. We're just putting it all in here and now it's in this tiny little vial.
Yeah,
I can
absolutely.
Imagine.
So that's what, we're working now with customers to gain that kind of credibility, right? So we're working with some commercial partners to walk them through the process and work with their data and show that, hey, we can encode it. It is safe. Here's your data coming out to really gain that kind of commercial viability. Definitely.
But you talk about the name Shannon. I asked about it at some point thinking it was potentially someone's wife or maybe someone's dog. But tell us about, what's the story behind the nickname Shannon?
Absolutely. So, it's not anyone's pet's name.
No, it's way more intelligent and classy than what I was anticipating it would
so
be.
Shannon is named after Claude Shannon. And so Claude Shannon is thought of as a father of information theory. So it was kind of in the 40s, I think, 1940s is when he did a lot of his work. And information theory is kind of like a set of algorithms that's used a lot in data storage. So you would be familiar with it unknowingly for every time you use zip files, MP3s, it's all using these kind of core algorithms that got developed. And so it's kind of an homage to data storage, kind of the start of data storage. And so that's where the instrument is named after Claude Shannon.
Was that a team decision or was that a founder decision just out of curiosity?
Yeah, it was definitely a little bit of a team decision.
Okay.
We had a couple names, different kind of options, some kind of catchy or different aspects, but really we came back to like we respect a lot of the people that came before us and a lot of the kind of history of data storage and what's paved the way to where we are today. And so that's where it seemed very fitting to kind of follow that footsteps and kind of pay respects essentially.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. What have you guys been able to store to date? I saw on, it was a news article on you guys, and it was a picture of, I guess, one of your team holding up, a tiny test tube, and it had a droplet of liquid like we've talked about in the bottom. And it said that it's pretty much holding the whole of English Wikipedia. So that's one thing, but what else have you guys been working to store basically?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been doing kind of a whole bunch of different files, different formats, different sizes, because we do want to test the full capability of this instrument and what we're able to store. So we've done everything from text files, which is kind of the most kind of basic file you could have, to MP3s. We've recently done some high quality kind of 4K movies we've been working on encoding. audio files, some kind of proprietary file formats to specific companies even. So we've really tried to say, like, does file format affect it? Do zip files affect it? How does it, based on how it was encoded or compressed, how does this really affect how we're able to encode it? So we've really tried to make sure that we've checked all of those options and made sure there's no kind of weird anomalies or anything that might occur. So we've had good success with a lot of different types of files. We haven't really come across one that we've just not been able to encode, because ultimately at the core of it, any file that got encoded or built or designed ultimately comes back to binary, right? And all we really care about is the binary into DNA. And so anything you can put into binary, we can then put into DNA.
Yeah.
So it is kind of ambivalent then to that file format, which is really nice.
But has there sort of been any sort of fun choices there? I can imagine. I think
Absolutely,
you mentioned there's some poetry in there or some.
Yeah. So the very first proof of principle was a Robert Frost poem, "The Road Not Taken." So that's kind of a
Very poetic,
a little bit corny, maybe, but a very fitting, because we took a different approach to how we're encoding that data into DNA. So we've done some different fun things. We did an Albert Einstein recording. So one of his lecture recordings. So that was one of our audio files we've done. We've done like a Wikipedia article that was like Boston Strong. So trying to kind of pay homage again to Boston. So we've done, it's definitely a good mix of different things. So we generally have fun picking the files. It's kind of a team decision a lot of times, or different files we're looking to grab. It allows us to have a little fun with it, because at the end of the day, if we're just choosing what to encode, we might as well make it something we like and fun.
Definitely. You mentioned before that people have been using this technique since the 90s, I think you mentioned. And I mean, often when we do speak to guests, the method or the design they're using already existed. Is it true that I read that DARPA, the US military's research arm, used DNA storage? I'm not sure if you're familiar, but I mean, you guys, I assume, aren't the only ones doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think your first question was about like those who've done it before and kind of previously and what's changed. So I'll tackle that one first. And if you think about, there's been demonstrations even since the 90s, if not earlier, about storing data into DNA. And again, a lot of it is based on that base-to-base process. So just taking bits, putting it into bases of DNA. And it's been evolved because that process has become faster with different off-the-shelf instruments and a little bit cheaper. But even so we took a different approach. Our approach is something that you could have done theoretically. It's not like anything too new in the biotech space. But I think what's really progressed over the last couple of decades has been the technology to build these DNA sequences. So even our prefabricated sequences, the cost efficiency of getting them, having them built, and then understanding of different technologies that we can use to kind of copy our data or even store it. So it's kind of been an evolution as we've become as like technologically more advanced dealing with DNA. And so I think it's at a nice point to where we've got a lot of background technology, background history, papers to kind of lean on, and then push forward and say, okay, how do we take this and extrapolate it and push it towards our needs? And I think that's allowed us to kind of have that door open and allow us to progress. And then your other aspect was kind of other people in the space. So one of the more public kind of figures in the space is Microsoft puts out some publications about it, as well as there is a DARPA grant out for DNA data storage. And for us, I think those are really cool things. It adds validity to DNA data storage, right? So a big player like Microsoft, the US government, these different aspects, these different entities see it as a useful storage medium and see the benefits of it. And it adds credibility to what we're trying to do. Even recently, there's been the DNA Data Storage Alliance, which we're part of. And that's kind of a collection of companies from storage companies, just standard storage companies, as well as people that are working in DNA digital data storage, working to kind of set industry standards, kind of making sure that how does this path move forward with DNA data storage, and even looking at how does it get adopted by technologies or by other companies. So really, it's kind of group effort to say, how do you make DNA data storage kind of viable to the public, get public recognition for it? As well as, I think the bigger person is the incumbent in the space, right?
Yeah.
So the incumbent is, how do you replace something like tape or hard drives that are still in the market? So although there's other people in DNA data storage, it's ultimately, how do you get to the point of replacing what's currently on the market? And I think that's kind of the bigger hurdle still to work to overcome.
Definitely. You mentioned some competitors there. I mean, in your view, do you think you could have like a first mover advantage, or is it pretty much in the field that the more the merrier, as you suggest that so much of the work will be pretty much building up public trust? What's your view on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll start with first is the competitors kind of in the similar space. We have like a core advantage on the way we encode that data. So by doing it with those kind of DNA molecules that are already prefabricated, we have the speed and cost kind of on our side, especially with our instrument Shannon, right? So this instrument is just kind of our differentiator. It really makes us unique kind of in the space to be able to really kind of make it commercially viable. And so that's where we kind of feel we're in a good space and continuing to push this along in this direction so we can really reach that commercial viability. It's hard to say whether it has to be a first mover versus kind of the second person in the space that can really dominate. I think the bigger thing is overcoming kind of those market risks of just, it's a new technology. It's the introduction of a new technology into a space that's historically been really good at continuing to decrease size and increase the capacity, right? Hard drives over years have followed Moore's law. But ultimately, if you think about hard drives, there is going to be a limit. At some point, you can only get so small.
Yeah, definitely.
What's cool about DNA is that ceiling is much, much farther away. So we can get orders of magnitude. We don't fall under that same Moore's law kind of principle, but we can be orders of magnitude every year, potentially increasing in data capacity, decreasing in size. And so because of that, I think there's a way for us to kind of really get into this market and really kind of show that we are unique and we can do really cool things. One of the coolest things I think about it is I don't think we can even fully understand all the implications of storing this much data.
Yeah, we're just
into
scratching
DNA,
the surface.
like into a small pool of DNA. And I think it's really cool to see what can a company do with this much information in DNA and this much information in such a small location. I think it really opens the door to allow people to think about problems in a very unique way compared to how they've had to think about it for the last couple of decades, just based on how data is currently stored in standard technology. So data is stored very linearly in a hard drive, but in DNA, it's not necessarily stored linearly anymore because it's a pool of DNA molecules. And how does that open the door for new technologies, new discoveries that previously weren't really possible?
Definitely. You also touched on, I guess, if we go back to the whole issue of public trust. I mean, now that we have data, if it's stored in this way, that can be so much more easily stored and moved around, so to speak. I mean, is it something that you guys worry about, data falling into the wrong hands, or would you still argue that it's safer than traditional methods?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you think about what standard method, right? So if you had a hard drive and it fell into someone else's hands, your main kind of safeguard to that is if your data is encrypted. So you kind of have a standard public-private key encryption method. And what we can do with data in DNA is store it the exact same way. So we can encrypt the data before it actually goes into the DNA.
Okay.
So you've at least now hit that same kind of security aspect as a hard drive. What's cool about DNA now, though, is you might actually add an extra layer of security, because for them to get that information out, you would just sequence it on a standard sequencer, right? So anyone could sequence it. However, not everyone has the ability to decode those sequences back into binary. So that unique mapping now has a second layer of kind of security. So you have not only the actual encryption, but you also have that decoding.
So you could steal it, but then if you don't have the technology to get it out, then it's pretty much useless, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's where I think you have the aspect of, you have to be able to say, okay, how do these sequence map to binary? And then also, how do I then unencrypt something?
Yes. Okay.
So it kind of it's at least as secure as standard hardware, if not more secure, I would say.
Okay, brilliant. And we also, I mean, we've touched on the security and the environmental aspects as well. But I mean, it can essentially last forever, right?
Yeah, that's what's really cool about data in DNA. And if you think about it, there's kind of three unique aspects. So we've touched on one. One is size. So you can put a lot of information in a really small amount of space. The second is longevity. It lasts a really long time, just naturally. So if you think about the woolly mammoth's been extinct for over 60,000 years, but we know the sequence of the woolly mammoth's DNA because we've been able to recover DNA that's at least 60,000 years old. So it shows that it kind of has that longevity, that perseverance over time. And then the other really cool aspect is the ability to replicate or copy itself. So in nature, it copies or replicates all of the time. What we can do in storing data into DNA, we can make copies of data in a very short amount of time for a very inexpensive process. So now, if you're also worried about, I only have one copy of it in DNA, you can undergo a process that's exponential and get hundreds of copies very, very quickly. And then all of a sudden, you can split these across the US or across the world and really kind of add to that security aspect. So it allows you to have a lot of copies of something that's in a very safe, secure, and really long-lasting kind of medium.
I mean, it's just incredibly mind-blowing to hear all about this. It's you touched on it earlier when you sort of talked about the first time that you saw the sequencing work. But I mean, was there any other time where, a sort of a very mind-blowing moment that you can remember, like, hey, I'm working on something pretty groundbreaking here? I mean, do you have some memorable milestones that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So about 6 months in, I've been working kind of with the team that we had over in the UK that's working to help us build the instrument. And so a lot of my work up to that point, you're seeing kind of CAD drawings or kind of visualizations of the instrument. And we're doing some of the lab experiments in Boston, but it was my first time getting to see it in person, was going to the UK and going to see it and kind of doing some of those initial prints that we were looking at or encoding data files. And as soon as you see it in person, it's just incredibly impressive. And I think that's kind of the point. It's like, holy cow, like this is something that's just on a whole nother level.
And we're talking about Shannon here, right? The building of Shannon. Is that what we're discussing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Right.
Okay,
yeah. Sorry. So the building of that DNA writer Shannon, because you go there and you get to see it operate, and you're looking at hundreds of thousands of spots a second that are getting created. And each of these spots is encoding information. And within minutes of printing, we've now encoded more data than anyone's ever encoded in DNA before, faster than anyone's ever encoded DNA data before. And it's just like, it's impressive, right? So you see it and you're like, it's been a dream. We've been working towards it, but really getting it to see it operate for that first time, working to encode information and seeing all of these spots get collected. It's just, it's really mind blowing to think that like this is what we've been working towards for years to build up to and kind of really create this instrument that's actually able to operate.
How do you guys envision this sort of scaling up in the long term, so to speak? I mean, maybe put more simply, how many Shannons would we need in the world to basically reap the benefits?
We see Shannon as kind of our first prototype instrument.
She's pretty large, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So she's definitely the size of a small room.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Probably, yeah, it's a small office, and it's a large printing press at the end of the day, right? So we're printing hundreds of thousands of individual reactions in order to kind of create the right DNA molecules we want to create in the time we want to create. So that instrument's able to do kind of at that megabit per second rate or close to it, and for us to really kind of gain that commercial viability, really start making an impact in the space, like you're saying, we need to kind of take it to the next level still. So how do you get to something that, say, is gigabits per second? So then you're actually at pretty fast operating speeds. And so Shannon is kind of our first prototype, and it allows us to gain that commercial viability or commercial demonstrations and kind of show people what can it do, still do some meaningful data, but not make the kind of impact you're saying of how do you start replacing data centers. And really it's going to be that next generation instrument that we're going to be working on the next couple of years to say, how do we actually start producing amounts of data that become meaningful to a company that they can say, okay, I'm storing petabytes of data a month into DNA instead of into a data center. And that really starts adding up quickly. So I don't think it's Shannon that's going to do that for us. I think it's going to be that next iteration that gets that higher throughput, higher impact, and then several of those machines. So I think we see it kind of as data as a service at first for these companies. Instead of them having these large instruments, them sending data, encoding it in DNA, and then receiving their kind of container of DNA.
But I mean, if we could get a little sci-fi, do we eventually envision that, okay, these massive data storage facilities, that they will be essentially replaced with a filing cabinet with a bunch of small test tubes? I mean, is that sort of where we're headed in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the dream for us. I think there's ultimately always going to be kind of a hybrid approach or something similar to where you have some DNA, some kind of classic silica media. But I think having a warehouse or having this kind of data center that does have these small samples, can operate on them, can put them into a sequencer, can write them, can edit them, anything like that, can make copies. I think that is what we see the future to be, to where you have this kind of vault of all this data that can store quite a bit of information, can do really cool things with it while it's still in that liquid form, in that DNA, and then allow you to still get all of your data and reap those benefits of your data set at any point.
Yeah, I can imagine you've got a bunch of clients lining up at the door. But as you said, you're already testing with a couple of companies. So
yeah, absolutely. So we've got some companies in kind of the oil and gas field, media field. So we're trying to kind of do some different types of media, different applications they're looking for, so that we can really kind of get what's the best thing for us in the market. What do we make sure as we look into developing future instruments, making sure it meets the needs of our customers as well. So really we've kind of been picky about who we're trying to work with so that we can gain the most information and say, okay, look, by doing this kind of working with this customer, we're able to really kind of say, okay, look, this is how we need to push forward and kind of create that path forward.
And are these guys, I mean, just out of curiosity, are they coming to you, or is this something that you guys sort of have to approach and I can imagine try to sell this very moonshot pitch to a company? Or how has it generally worked, if you can share? Yeah,
so I mean, I think it's a combination. So I think from some press we've done, as well as just from us saying, okay, look, we think this would be a really nice type of customer. Most people are really excited about the technology. There's a lot of cool aspects about it that solve a lot of pain points in the current industry.
Do people want to come and see it? I mean, I guess not in the past year, people haven't been able to, but I can imagine there's a lot of interest to come and see it in action.
Absolutely, there definitely is. We send a lot of videos and such, so that's the best we can do kind of in this COVID time right now.
Yeah.
But I think there is a lot of hope for people to come see it, because it is really cool to see it in person operating. Like I said, like you get to see all these minuscule picoliter-sized drops kind of running across this instrument, getting collected. It's a really impressive large instrument that once you realize kind of what it's doing, it's really mind-blowing. And so I think we have quite a few customers or people that are interested because of the pain points they currently face.
Yeah.
A lot of what I was surprised about when I first joined Catalog is I didn't realize how many people still use tape as a storage medium.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised to hear that.
So
there we go.
There's still just warehouses and warehouses of tape and film. And it's because it's a fairly secure medium and it lasts longer than a lot of other kind of mediums. So tape lasts, say, 30 years pretty securely. The issue, though, is these media companies, they don't want to lose out on that information, right? That's literally all of their revenues come from these stuff they've stored on this tape. And so what they do is they actually put it on new tape every, say, 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so they don't digitize the files. They just put it back onto tape again. And then, okay.
Exactly right. So then if you think about it, like that's a great initial market, is just how do you replace tape?
Yeah.
Now, I think that's only the beginning for us. I think there's a lot of other really cool applications, but it's a very kind of straightforward of, this is an old medium that I was shocked they even still use. There's a lot of problems with it. And DNA is a very nice solution for that alone.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that if they don't digitize and that they're willing to go for something so high tech. But super interesting. But what's the next milestone for you guys? I guess, what are you sort of working towards now?
For us, there's a couple kind of key things. So one is, because of Shannon, we've now write at a high rate compared to kind of the market and compared to even sequencing. And so now we've actually surpassed our sequencing speeds because of this instrument. And so in the next couple of years, we're really going to work on saying, how do we scale this sequencing side? because people that encode their data are going to want to at some point be able to read out at least portions of it. So making sure that that's a viable solution, so that once it's in there, we have quick ways to be able to access it and read that information back to a user. So I would say one side is just read, and then the second, as I was kind of referencing before, is how do you really scale up this instrument, and how do you take it to the next level to really become commercially viable? Because right now it's incredible what we've done. Shannon's an incredible instrument, and it's awesome to be able to work with these customers and actually encode like sizable amounts of data. But for us to really make an impact and really start saying, okay, how do we gain lots of customers? It's really saying, okay, we need to make this a whole 1,000 times faster than what we're at currently. And so that has its own challenges, but that's going to be the next couple of years on our hardware development team, is saying, okay, let's take this current instrument and let's say, what do we like about it? What did not go well with it? What could have been done better? And how do we reach now 1,000 times faster? And so we've got some plans, and we've got a lot of kind of de-risking and prototypes in the works now. But it's really saying how in the next couple of years, I think we're going to have some really cool, exciting tech coming out for really pushing these write and read speeds to the next level to become that commercially viable product.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously very excited to see how you guys develop. I think I have a better understanding of it now, but we're really excited to see everything unfold. But thank you so much, Sean. It's been, really interesting. And as I said, I'm looking forward to watching you guys bloom, I guess is a good way to say it.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Lesley. Thank you for doing this. It was a nice conversation, and it was a great time talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for listening to Can Design Save Us by the Index Project. I'm your host, Lesley Price, and this episode was produced by Sidsel, Kaae, Nørgaard, with music by Kristina, Lilleskov. Join us for the next episode where we dive into the future of environmental conservation.